Jericho, the first city on earth. Part 1. A place of legend and stone before the pyramids of Giza were carved from stone. Before Babylon's ziggurats rose from the plains, was even a whisper in the Mesopotamian dust. There was Jericho. It sits quietly now, half swallowed by the earth in the West Bank desert, near the Jordan River. Unassuming, forgotten by time. But beneath the layers of sand and stone lies a question that challenges everything we know about the birth of civilization. Was this the mound of Tell Sultan, the first true city on earth? For centuries, Jericho was known not for being the first, but for being the fallen. A city whose walls, so the Bible says, collapsed with the sound of trumpets and the faith of warriors. The book of Joshua tells us that Jericho was the gateway to the Promised Land, a city cursed, conquered, and burned. That dramatic tale, etched into religious memory, became Jericho's legacy for thousands of years. But then came the archaeologists, and what they found was something far older and far more mysterious than any biblical account. The Jericho of Scripture stood around 1400 BCE, but the Jericho, unearthed by science, it goes back at least 11,000 years. That's nearly 5,000 years before the first pyramid stone was laid. Longer ago than the invention of the wheel. Before written language, before metal, before kings, they found traces of people who settled permanently, building homes, farming wheat and barley, storing food, burying their dead, and even constructing monumental architecture. Towering walls, a 28-foot stone tower. In a time when most of humanity was still hunting and gathering, these people were shaping the landscape. So what do we call this place? A village? A town? Or the first city? The contrast is staggering. One Jericho is a spiritual battleground divinely destroyed by faith and fire. The other is a miracle of early human cooperation and survival, fortified not against armies, but perhaps against nature or fear of the unknown. One is steeped in legend, the other in stone and dust and bone. And that mystery only deepens. Who built the first walls and why? What did they fear? Were these early inhabitants the inventors of city life, of religion, of memory itself? Why did they bury their dead with plastered skulls' faces, reconstructed in careful detail, perhaps to remember ancestors, or to keep the past close in a world just learning to shape the future? Jericho doesn't just challenge our understanding of urban origins, it flips the script entirely. It asks, what is a city? Is it the size, the people, the power, or the memory it carries beneath its feet? Somewhere in these ancient layers, beneath every broken wall and scattered shard, there's a deeper story, not of a single city, but of humanity itself taking its first great step into the unknown. Jericho, the first city on earth. To answer that question, we must dig through time, through myth, through mud and ash and faith. Because somewhere in this forgotten corner of the desert, the story of cities begins. Jericho, the first city on earth. When we think of a city, we think of size, streets and skylines, commerce and culture, noise, people, power. But the true essence of a city isn't steel and concrete, its structure, organization, purpose. So what makes a city? A city, in its simplest form, is more than just a group of people living together. It has a permanent population, fixed dwellings or capture, not tense social structure and governance, a food surplus to sustain non-farmers' trade networks, defensive walls or systems of protection, and often, though not always, some form of religion or ritual. So let's return to ancient Jericho over 10,000 years ago, during what we now call the pre-pottery Neolithic period. Did Jericho check any of these boxes? We begin with population. Archaeologists estimate that Jericho may have supported 300 to 600 people, perhaps more at its peak. That's small by today's standards, but for 9000 BCE, it was a metropolis. Most human groups at the time were small, nomadic bands, but here at Jericho, people stayed. They built homes out of mud brick, shaped into neat circular dwellings with plastered floors. These were not makeshift camps, were permanent, maintained, and repaired. The people of Jericho weren't passing through, were laying down roots. Why? The answer lies in the earth around them. The Sultan spring poured water year-round into this desert, creating a small oasis. Fertile soil meant crops, wheat and barley could be grown and stored. Surplus grain meant some people didn't need to farm at all. This was the first hint of economic specialization. With permanence and surplus comes hierarchy. Someone to organize labor, store food, settle disputes. While we haven't found palaces or written laws, the very act of building a wall and a tower points to planned cooperation. This was not a loose band of hunter-gatherers. This was a community with shared goals. Now the famous walls. Jericho's massive stone wall, nearly 12 feet high and 6 feet thick, surrounds part of the settlement. Next to it stood the Tower of Jericho, rising 28 feet into the air. This is one of the earliest known monumental structures in human history. But why did they build it? Defense against invaders, possibly. But some scholars suggest it protected against flooding, or even had a ritual purpose, a spiritual beacon in the landscape. Either way, it shows planning, labor management, and a collective vision. Jericho also appears to have been an early node in a trade network. Materials not native to the area like obsidian and seashells have been found at the site. These came from hundreds of miles away. Even in its infancy, Jericho was connected to a wider world. And then there's the spiritual element. Plastered skulls were buried under floors, human faces recreated in lime and clay, perhaps to honor ancestors or preserve identity beyond death. Some dwellings may have served as shrines. Whatever their purpose, they hint at a growing human need to connect life with the afterlife. All of this, the food, the homes, the walls, the worshipies, part of what historians call the Neolithic Revolution. A time when humans shifted from nomadic hunting to settled farming, from foraging to producing, from surviving to shaping. Jericho wasn't just an early city. It was part of a global turning point. The first signs that humanity was entering a new age of permanence, planning, and identity. Other sites would follow. Other cities would rise. But Jericho came first. Or so it seems. Still, a question lingers in the dust. Was Jericho truly the first city, or just the first one we found? A sunburnt valley, where temperatures soar and the land cracks beneath the heat, there lies a miracle. It's called Jericho. Surrounded by desert and stone, Jericho stands as an anomaly, a pocket of life in a sea of silence. To understand how a city could rise here more than 10,000 years ago, we must begin not with walls or towers, but with water. Jericho lies in the Jordan Rift Valley, part of the Great Fault Line that runs from Syria down through the Dead Sea and into Africa. And here, nestled more than 250 meters below sea level, the lowest city on Earth, something extraordinary happens. A freshwater spring bubbles up from the earth. It is called Ayniz Sultan. Ayniz Sultan flows with quiet persistence, a rare, consistent source of life in an otherwise hostile land. It has done so for thousands of years, never drying, never ceasing. And to ancient humans, it must have seemed like magic. At the end of the last ice age, as glaciers retreated and climates shifted, humans wandered. Most were still nomadic, chasing herds and gathering plants. But then, some found the spring, and they stayed. The spring transformed Jericho into an oasis, a green jewel in the desert. Round it, reeds, grasses, and trees took root. Small plots of land became fields. Barley and wheat began to grow. Goats and sheep grazed on irrigated grasslands. It was here that humans first began to farm. The geography was perfect. Jericho sat in a natural basin, shielded by hills but open enough to allow trade and migration. The Dead Sea was nearby, and so was the Jordan River. Important landmarks even in prehistory. But it was the spring that made everything possible. The settlers here learned to manage water. They dug irrigation ditches, stored grain, and planted systematically. This wasn't just survival. This was an adaptation, innovation, the early blueprint of agriculture. Around the spring, a community began to take shape. Homes were built close to the source, and as generations passed, the settlement grew in complexity. The early round houses clustered tightly suggest that people connected not just by space, but by cooperation. Today, the site is known as Tell Sultana, mound built up from layer upon layer of human habitation. Each new generation built atop the old, and over time, the settlement rose like a sedimentary memory. This pattern of rebirth is found in cities across the ancient world. But here, in Jericho, it began. The surrounding desert reminds us just how precious Jericho's position was. To the west, barren hills. To the east, the harsh Judean wilderness. But in Jericho, green flourished. It was a magnet for people, for animals, for trade, a place of permanence in a world of uncertainty. Water gave them more than crops. It gave them time to build, to bury, to remember, to imagine more than just the next meal, to imagine a future. Even now, the spring flows. It has seen tribes and empires rise and fall. It has outlasted kings and prophets. The same water that once fed the first farmers of Jericho still trickles through the soil today. Without it, there would be no Jericho, and perhaps no cities at all. The first to settle, imagine a time before nations, before writing, before even the idea of a city. It's a time when survival meant movement, following the herds, chasing the rain, a world where home was wherever the sun set. But here at Jericho, something changed. Over 10,000 years ago, at the foot of the Judean hills, a small group of people did the unthinkable. They stopped, and they stayed. Drawn by the constant water of the Zelten spring, these early settlers began building the first permanent homes. Not tents, not temporary lean-tos, but structures meant to last. They crafted roundhouses from sun-dried mud brick, packed tightly with straw, shaped by hand. Floors were made from polished lime plaster, smooth, deliberate. Roofs were likely domed and thatched with reeds from the nearby marshes. This wasn't just shelter, it was architecture. Inside, there was a central hearth for cooking and warmth. Stone tools littered the floor, flint blades, grinding stones, and bone awls for piercing hides. They still hunted gazelle, wild cattle, birds, and fish. But increasingly, they planted seeds instead of chasing prey. They gathered wheat, barley, and lentils, and learned how to tame plants to the rhythm of the seasons. The shift was slow, generational. But here, on the banks of the spring, hunting and gathering gave way to farming, and farming led to stability. Food was stored in pits dug into the floor, protected from animals and the elements. Leftover grain meant families could eat through winter. It also meant time to plan, to build, to think. Time to pass on stories and skills. This was part of a wider transformation, the Neolithic revolution, spreading slowly across the Fertile Crescent. But Jericho was one of the first places where it happened. It became more than a settlement. It became a prototype for the world's first communities. They left behind clues, microliths, small stone blades set into wooden shafts, mortar and pestles worn smooth from years of grinding grain, tools to work leather, cut meat, and carve bone. Everything was made by hand, passed down, and shared. Their lives were hard disease, injury, drought, all very real threats. But still, they endured. For centuries, they buried their dead beneath the homes they built, perhaps to honor them, perhaps to keep them close. Some skulls were treated with extraordinary care, faces recreated with clay, seashells set in for eyes. Were these ancestors, shamans, community leaders? We may never know, but the act of remembrance points to something new. Identity, memory, culture. Layer by layer, Jericho grew, not just in size, but in meaning. These first settlers weren't just building homes, they were laying down the foundation of something entirely new, permanence. In an age when movement was survival, they chose to root themselves in the earth, and that choice, simple, quiet, revolutionary, changed the course of history. We walk through cities now like it's ordinary, like it was always this way. But once, long ago, it was a radical act to stay in one place. To plant a seed, to build a wall, to say this is home. Jericho was among the first places where humanity made that choice. Jericho, the first city on Earth. Part 3. The tower that shouldn't exist. In 1952, British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon and her team were digging beneath the sands of Zoltan. What they uncovered would shock the world. Beneath centuries of ruins and rubble lay something astonishing. A massive stone wall, and beside it, something even more mysterious. A tower, nearly 30 feet tall, built more than 10,000 years ago. It should not exist. This structure, now called the Tower of Jericho, is the oldest known monumental stone building on Earth, built during the pre-pottery Neolithic period. This tower predates Stonehenge by 5,000 years, and the Egyptian pyramids by more than 6,000. It wasn't just tall, it was complex. The tower stands about 28 feet high and 33 feet wide at its base. Inside, a narrow stone staircase spirals upward, suggesting not just architectural planning, but engineering. Who built it? Why and how? No kings, no priests, no writing, no metal tools. At the time, the people of Jericho lived in mud brick roundhouses, farming in small plots, trading simple goods, and yet they moved hundreds of tons of stone. They carved out a deep trench, constructed a retaining wall nearly 6 feet thick, and then built this tower atop it. So what was it for? Scholars have debated this for decades. 3 main theories have emerged. The most obvious explanation: defense. Jericho's tower may have been a lookout, a place to scan for enemies or wild animals on the horizon. Paired with the surrounding wall, it could have served as an early fortification. But there's a problem. The wall doesn't fully surround the site. It protects one side, the slope facing the spring. Odd for a defensive structure. Some archaeologists believe the wall and tower were built to control flash floods coming down from the surrounding highlands. Jericho sits in a depression below sea level, and sudden rainfall in the Judean hills could have meant disaster. Perhaps a watch post to monitor water levels or initiate early warnings. In this view, the wall acted like a dam. The tower is possible. But then there's the third theory. What if it wasn't practical at all? It may have unified the people through shared effort and shared awe. What if it was symbolic, a place of ritual, of spiritual power? Humans were already thinking big. Some scholars believe the tower marks time itself, aligned with the shadow of a nearby mountain during the summer solstice sunset. Others say it may have been a communal gathering space, where ceremonies were held and the community's identity reinforced. Climbing the tower may have symbolized ascent to the heavens, to the ancestors, or to power. Kenyon called it a remarkable achievement, and she was right. Whatever its purpose, the Tower of Jericho proved something profound, that long before kings ruled or pyramids rose, a tower that touched the sky. Not for glory or conquest, but perhaps simply to say, without metal tools or beasts of burden. The builders of Jericho relied on sheer human will and ingenuity. They used stone picks and antler picks to carve the trench. They shaped limestone boulders by hand. They worked in teams. They planned. They imagined. This was the dawn of architecture. It's the birth of collective construction. In the beginning, there was Jericho. A city without kings, but with a tower. Her name was Kathleen Kenyon, and she was about to change everything we thought we knew about human history. We are here, and we will remain. But from burials, secrets in the soil, Kathleen Kenyon and the ancestors of Jericho, she cut deep, narrow trenches straight down through the mound, exposing each layer in sequence. Seashells were inserted for eyes, giving them an almost haunting gaze. In the 1950s, a woman in a wide-brimmed hat arrived at a dusty mound in the Jordan Valley. Tel Ezelton, the ancient heart of Jericho, had been excavated before, but no one had peeled back its layers the way Kenyon did. Armed with meticulous methodology and a revolutionary new approach, she saw not just ruins but time itself, layered like a cake beneath her feet. Kenyon's greatest contribution was her use of stratigraphy, a technique borrowed from geology. Her field notes, diagrams, and photographs remain a gold standard in archaeology today. Like pages in a book, the soil spoke. Every stratum telling a story of people who lived, died, rebuilt, and returned. And in Jericho, there were many such stories. One of the most striking revelations came not from buildings. Kenyon found that the people of ancient Jericho buried their dead beneath their homes, curled up in fetal positions, placed beneath floors of plaster. In some cases, the bodies were decapitated, their skulls removed after burial, and then something even more unusual happened. The skulls were reconstructed. human faces modeled in plaster, carefully shaped with clay and pigment. These weren't just remains, they were memorials, kind of prehistoric portraiture. The deep trench she cut at Tepe is still studied, still sampled, still revealing secrets. Who were these people? Ancestors? Community leaders? Shamans? She uncovered a dialogue with the dead, a way of life where memory lived in stone and plaster, and ancestors watched from beneath your floor. Some scholars believe they were revered figures, perhaps kept in homes, passed down through generations, used in ancestor worship or spiritual rituals. The people of Jericho didn't just bury their dead, they preserved them, honored them, perhaps even consulted them. Kathleen Kenyon documented these finds with extraordinary precision. She was rigorous, sometimes criticized for being too cautious in her interpretations, but her work rewrote the history of the Neolithic Levant. Before Kenyon, Jericho was often thought of mainly as the biblical city of Joshua, walls tumbling in divine triumph. But Kenyon showed that Jericho's story was much, much older. She uncovered evidence of continuous habitation dating back over 10,000 years, long before metal, writing, or even pottery. She pushed the timeline of urban development further back than anyone had imagined. The world she revealed was not primitive, but deeply symbolic, spiritually complex, and socially organized. People who remembered their dead, who shaped human faces out of the earth, who turned memory into ritual. Today, archaeologists still follow in her footsteps literally, and her stratigraphic method remains the foundation for how we explore ancient settlements across the globe. Kathleen Kenyon didn't just dig up bones. Through her eyes, we don't just see ruins, we see people. Through her work, Jericho is no longer just a place on a map. It's a window into the deep soul of human civilization. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Jericho, the first city on Earth. Part 4. The Spirit of Stone. Death, memory, and ritual. An ancient Jericho memory shaped in clay, embedded in the skull, anchored in stone. In Jericho, the first city on Earth, the dead never really left the living. Long before temples rose in Mesopotamia or Egypt's priests spoke to the gods, the people of Jericho practiced something far more intimate, a spiritual life rooted in home, family, and the ever-present dead. In the earliest layers of Neolithic Jericho, archaeologists found a striking pattern. The dead were not taken far away. They were buried beneath the floor of the home, right where daily life continued above them. Children, women, men all lay in shallow graves, their bodies curled tightly, as if sleeping. And sometimes, the story didn't end there. In some cases, after the body had decomposed, the skull was exhumed. The face was then rebuilt in plaster nose, lips, even cheekbones sculpted with care. Cowrie shells or stones were inserted for eyes, and pigment may have been used to tint the features. These are known as the plastered skulls of Jericho, and they are some of the earliest known portraits in human history. In the shadow of ancient walls and beneath the dust of time, something profound lies buried. Not treasure, not tools, but memory. But they weren't hidden. Many were found in household settings, arranged in groups, placed on ledges, displayed in what seemed to be shrine-like areas of the home. Were they ancestors? Protective spirits, objects of reverence we don't fully know? Yeah, but we can feel the emotional weight they carried. Beyond the skulls, Jericho offers other clues into a spiritual or ritual life. Small pits with burnt offerings, carefully arranged animal bones, tools buried with meaning rather than utility. These aren't random acts, they suggest ceremony, repetition, and a growing understanding of the symbolic connection between object, space, and story. And the very place they built, Tepe became a kind of sacred landscape. With each generation building atop the last, the mound itself grew layered with the lives, deaths, and memories of those who came before. This wasn't just a settlement. It became a repository of memory, both literal and spiritual. In many later cultures, ancestor worship becomes formalized, shrines, altars, tombs, and rituals. But Jericho may be the seed of that tradition. These early inhabitants of Jericho were perhaps the first to truly blur the line between life and death, between the home and the grave. Created a world where memory lived not in stories, but in bones and plaster, eyes that watched across time. The plastered skulls found at Jericho are haunting not because they are dead, but because they are so deeply human. They speak to our primal longing for continuity, for connection with those who came before us and those we leave behind. Here, in the earliest city, people weren't building monuments to gods in the sky. They were building connections to the past, layer by layer, breath by breath. In Jericho, memory was architecture. Death was not an ending, it was a transformation. And in every plastered face, we see the first glimmers of what would one day become religion, remembrance, and the human soul. Life behind the walls. Daily life in ancient Jericho, we've spoken of towers, of skulls, and of silent walls. But what about the heartbeat of Jericho? The daily rhythm of its people. Before the Bible, before the city's fall, there was life. Ordinary, extraordinary life. A family moves out to their plots near the vital spring of Ain Zaltan. Come closer. Let us step into a day in Jericho, 10,000 years ago. The Neolithic revolution is in full bloom, and Jericho is one of its earliest centers. Morning begins early. The cool desert air is already warming. Here the soil is rich. Unusually so for such an arid region. And this has changed everything. Jericho's people are no longer nomads. They've planted wheat and barley, carefully selected over generations. Farming is laborious, but it's life. With each harvest, they store grain in plastered silos. Some of the first permanent food storage structures in history, no longer chasing game across the plains, they now plan for seasons. For years, for generations. Alongside farming, another revolution unfolds. Animal domestication. Goats, once wild, are now penned, bred for milk, meat, and hides. Eventually, sheep and maybe even pigs join them. The people of Jericho are becoming managers of life, reshaping nature to suit their needs. Home is a simple round structure made of sun-dried mud bricks with a conical roof of reeds. But boundaries aren't rigid. Survival requires every hand. At the center, a hearth. Food simmers in clay pots. A woman grinds grain with a stone quern. A toddler plays nearby with a carved animal figurine. Elders are respected, their knowledge passed down in work and in story. Obsidian blades, seashells, salt, bitumen, beads, and knowledge. Children are not schooled. They learn by watching, by doing, by imitating. Women maintain the home, tend the gardens, and raise children. Men often hunt, build, or craft tools. Even in this early age, Jericho is not isolated. The land is fertile, but surrounded by a harsh desert. When something goes wrong, people turn to ritual, to the spirits, to the ancestors, to hope. Its wealth of spring water and food attracts others. Early trade networks connected it to Anatolia, the Levant, and even the Red Sea. What do they trade? Jericho may be a small place, but it is becoming part of something larger, an early web of civilization. But life in Jericho is not idyllic. Droughts threaten, flash floods, especially near the spring, can devastate. Wild animals still roam. Disease is not understood. A single blight can ruin a harvest. There are no hospitals. Here at the dawn of settled life, something profound is happening. People are building not just homes, but meaning. They're organizing space, planning seasons, dividing labor, sharing a belief. They're learning to cooperate, to specialize, to compromise. That is what a city demands. They are not so different from us. They worked, they loved, they feared, they remembered. And in the flickering firelight of ancient Jericho, we see the first glimmer of something enduring, the human dream of community. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Jericho, the first city on earth. Part 5 was Jericho truly the first? Tale of ancient rivals for thousands of years. Jericho has claimed a powerful title, the first city on earth. But is that true? Across the ancient Near East, other sites have risen from the sands of time. Places like Çatalhöyük, Göbekli, Tepe, and Uruk, each with their own claim to greatness. Today we compare these ancient marvels and ask the question, was Jericho truly the first? Let's start with chronology. Jericho's earliest permanent settlement dates back to around 9600 BC, just after the last ice age ended. That makes it older than Çatalhöyük in Anatolia by over 2,000 years, and nearly 6,000 years older than Uruk in Sumer. Only Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, rivals it in age, with monumental structures appearing as early as 9500 BC. So by the clock, Jericho is indeed among the first. But being first is about more than just age. To truly compare, we need to ask, what defines a city? Is it permanent housing? Large population? Organized religion? Trade networks? Social hierarchy? Let's examine the contenders. Jericho had permanent dwellings, a centralized water source, evidence of long-term planning, and even public architecture like the tower and stone wall, built around 8000 BCE. It also shows early signs of ritual behavior, such as the plastered skulls, and had long-distance trade in obsidian and shells. But Jericho's population likely numbered only in the hundreds. There's no evidence of writing, and no temples or palaces. It was revolutionary, but still very early in the urban experiment. It's just a few hundred kilometers north. Göbekli Tepe emerges at almost the same time. It boasts enormous stone circles, decorated with carvings of animals and abstract symbols, monumental religious architecture built before farming. Yet Göbekli Tepe wasn't a city. It had no houses, no permanent population, and no farms. It was likely a pilgrimage or ritual, said astonishing, but not urban. Now, fast forward to Çatalhöyük, around 7500 BC. This Anatolian settlement was a true dense urban cluster, with thousands of people living in closely packed homes, entered through the roof rather than the door. There were no streets, just a honeycomb of rooftops and courtyards. Inside homes were shrines, burials, and wall art. Trade flourished, tools improved. But there's a key difference. Çatalhöyük had no public buildings, no temples, no palaces, no central authority. It was a large community, but one without a formal hierarchy. Then comes Uruk, around 4000 BC, in southern Mesopotamia. We see the hallmarks of a true city, ziggurats rising from the earth, temples and palaces at the core. A complex bureaucracy. The invention of writing cuneiform was used to manage trade and taxes, canals and defensive walls. A population in the tens of thousands, Uruk wasn't just a city. It was the blueprint for civilization. So, where does this leave Jericho? In terms of age, it is unmatched. In terms of urban complexity, it lags behind later cities like Uruk, but culturally, it represents something unique. A people settling down for the first time. A moment when humanity pivoted from survival to settlement, memory, and ritual. Jericho is not a city in the modern sense, but it is the seed, the first bold step into a new kind of life. Was Jericho the first city? Maybe not by today's standards, but it was the first place we could truly see ourselves, planting, building, remembering, and dreaming of permanence in a fleeting world. Jericho in the Bible, walls, war, and the search for truth, then fall. It is one of the most iconic scenes in all of Scripture. Trumpets blare, warriors shout, the walls of Jericho tremble. But what happened at Jericho during the time of Joshua? Was there a city here to conquer? Did the walls truly come crashing down? To answer these questions, we must shift forward in time, leaving behind Neolithic roundhouses and ancestral skulls, and entering the Bronze Age. By the early Bronze Age, Jericho was no longer a sleepy village. It had become a fortified urban center with ramparts, gates, and imposing walls. Archaeologists believe that around 2000 BCE, Jericho was a thriving Canaanite city, strategically placed, wealthy from trade, and guarded by massive stone defenses. It was one of many city-states dotting the Levant in this era, each ruled by its local king. March around the city once for 6 days. On the 7th day, blow the trumpets, ... the walls will collapse. This was the city that would have existed during the traditional period of the Exodus and conquest. It's commonly dated between 1400 to 1200 BC. The first major victory of the Israelites in the Promised Land. This is the Jericho of Joshua's story. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands." Joshua 6, the story is epic. Divine promise, ritual siege, a miraculous collapse. But is it history or is it a legend? In the 1930s, British archaeologist John Garstang believed he had found the answer. He uncovered a thick destruction, layer-collapsed mud brick, walls alongside charred wood, burnt grain, and a sudden end to city life. Garstang dated the destruction to around 1400 BC, matching the biblical timeline. It was hailed as stunning proof of the Bible's accuracy. But then came Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s. Using modern methods, stratigraphy, and radiocarbon dating, she reached a very different conclusion. Kenyon dated Jericho's final Bronze Age destruction not to 1400 BC, but around 1550 BC, a full century too early for Joshua's conquest. She also found no signs of habitation during the 13th century BC, the time when many scholars now believe the conquest might have occurred. In other words, during the era of Joshua, Jericho was likely a ruin, abandoned. What then destroyed Jericho's great Bronze Age city? Most scholars today point to the Egyptian invasion of the region or internal collapse during the chaotic end of the Middle Bronze Age. Cities across Canaan were destroyed or abandoned around 1550 BCE, including Jericho among them. Afterward, it was resettled only briefly in the Iron Age and never returned to its former glory. So where does that leave the biblical story? Some scholars suggest that the story of Jericho may preserve a memory, a cultural echo of a real city's fall. Others see it as a theological narrative, not meant as literal history, but as symbolic truth. A story of faith, obedience, and divine intervention. And a few still hold to Garstang's early date, arguing that Kenyon's methods were too narrow, or that we simply haven't found the right layer yet. The truth is, Jericho has lived many lives. A village of roundhouses in the Neolithic. A trade hub fortified with walls. A Canaanite city in the Bronze Age. A ruin at the feet of empires. A symbol retold across millennia. It may not be the city Joshua brought down with trumpets, but it was a city whose walls did fall again, and again under the weight of war, time, and memory. In the end, perhaps the real miracle of Jericho, was not that its walls fell once, but that it stood so long and still stands today. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Jericho, the first city on Earth. Part 6. Jericho through the ages. A city that refused to die. We often think of ancient cities as belonging to the past, ruins frozen in time. Their stories long since ended, but Jericho is different. This is a place that has been reborn again and again. From Neolithic settlement to Canaanite city, from Hellenistic estate to Roman garden town, from Islamic fortress to modern village, Jericho has lived many lives. It is not just the world's oldest city, it is one of its most enduring. Archaeologists at Tell Sultan have unearthed over 23 layers of occupation, each one representing a different chapter in Jericho's incredible story. Between the city's founding nearly 10,000 years ago and today, Jericho has been destroyed, abandoned, and rebuilt countless times. Each time, people returned. Each time, life continued. After centuries of silence following the Bronze and Iron Age collapses, Jericho was reborn again in the Hellenistic period. Around the 2nd century BCE, under the rule of the Hasmonean dynasty, Jericho became a royal estate. The area's fertile soil and natural springs turned it into a kind of desert paradise, dotted with gardens, orchards, and palaces. The city's famed balsam plantations, rare and valuable. Perfume-producing plant made Jericho famous across the Greek and Roman worlds. When the Romans arrived, Jericho flourished again. It became a winter retreat for the wealthy, especially under Herod the Great, who ruled Judea under Roman authority. Herod built an extravagant palace complex near Jericho, complete with gardens, aqueducts, pools, and fountains, a luxurious oasis in the wilderness. Roman Jericho was both beautiful and strategic. Located near trade routes, connected the Jordan Valley to Jerusalem and the broader empire. In the 7th century CE, Jericho became part of the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. Under the Umayyads, a new palace was built at nearby Khirbat al-Mafjar, showcasing early Islamic art, mosaics, and architecture. The site was abandoned after an earthquake in the 8th century. But Jericho itself continued to be inhabited throughout the Abbasid, Ayyubid, and Mamluk periods. During the Crusades, Jericho was contested, briefly falling under Frankish control. It had never regained the urban importance it had enjoyed under the Romans. They kept planting, harvesting, trading, and living. Through natural disasters, wars, empire changes, and abandonment, Jericho endured, and yet full of life. Even when the city was reduced to a small village or oasis camp, people stayed. To this day, Jericho remains inhabited, the lowest city on Earth, sitting nearly 850 feet below sea level, surrounded by the harsh desert. What makes Jericho special is not just how old it is, it's how alive it has remained. Jericho isn't a single city frozen in time. It's a palimpsest place where layer upon layer of human experience is written into the earth. It was a cradle of early farming, a walled Bronze Age fortress, a symbol in sacred texts, playground for kings, a humble village. And still today, a living city with stories yet to tell. In a world where civilizations rise and fall, Jericho teaches us the power of resilience, strength of place, the depth of memory. In the stones of Jericho, we don't just find the first steps of civilization. We find the stubborn spark of human continuity, the will to stay, to rebuild, and to remember. It is the city that would not die, the first city. A reflection on beginnings from ancestral skulls to royal palaces. From ritual shrines to modern-day streets, we've walked through more than 10,000 years. From round mud brick homes to stone towers. Now we ask the question that has hovered over Jericho like desert haze since the very beginning. Was this truly the first city on Earth? Cities don't appear in an instant, they form slowly, layer by layer. So what makes a city a city? A settled population, permanent dwellings, food production, and storage, defense and organization. Trade and ritual memory and continuity. By these standards, Jericho, at least by 8000 BCE, was something remarkable. It had walls, public architecture, and signs of social coordination. It had a water source that gave rise to agriculture in an unforgiving land. It had burial customs, perhaps even a belief in an afterlife, a connection to ancestors, sense of place. No other known settlement from this early period shows such complexity, longevity, or intentional design. Yes, Göbekli Tepe is older, but it wasn't a city, only a sacred site. Çatalhöyük was populous, but had no streets, walls, or hierarchy. Uruk was grand, but it came thousands of years later. Jericho was first in many things. The first known tower, the first long-term defensive wall. One of the first communities to show signs of urban consciousness. It may not be the first in every category, but as a whole, it stands as perhaps the first place where people truly said, "Here we build. Here we stay." Why did they build it? The desire not just to survive, but to organize, remember, and belong. Why here, in the middle of the desert, on the edge of a lifeless sea? Perhaps because they could. Because the spring at Ines, Alton offered a whisper of stability. Because in the face of chaos, floods, war, drought, they chose to build something that might last. This is the essence of civilization, to stack stone upon stone, not only for shelter, but for meaning. Jericho is not just a place, it's a palimpsest of human longing. To live in one place long enough that your ancestors are buried beneath your floor. To build a tower, not to hide, but to stand watch, to return, even after destruction. Because the memory of the city is stronger than the silence that follows. If Jericho is the first city, then it is also the first dream. A dream of permanence in a world of change. A dream that people could come together, build, organize, and outlast the seasons. It teaches us that before we invented writing or the wheel, we invented the idea of home. We built walls not just to protect, but to define who we are. And though the stones have crumbled, the idea still stands. Jericho, the first city on Earth, perhaps, but certainly one of the first places where we learned to live together and to remember. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.